Jimmy's heroic act of saving an elderly man from a pit bull attack left him unnoticed the next day. Yet it became the catalyst for a life-changing encounter. The story unfolds in a dusty, impoverished neighborhood where 12-year-old Jimmy navigates daily struggles with quiet determination. Jimmy walked slowly through the dusty streets, his bare feet kicking up small puffs of dirt with every step. The houses he passed were small and worn, their walls cracked and the paint long since faded under the relentless sun and rain. Children played in the narrow alleys, their laughter echoing off the brick and concrete. But Jimmy wasn't in the mood to join them. He had just finished helping his mom and was already thinking about what else he could do to ease her burden. The neighborhood was always noisy, a symphony of rusted mufflers, barking dogs, and the occasional argument between neighbors. To Jimmy, these sounds were the soundtrack of his life. His daily routine was simple: sell candy outside the school gates in the morning, run errands for neighbors during the day, and help his mom with household chores. Today was no different, and Jimmy felt the familiar exhaustion seep into his bones as he trudged home. His shirt, frayed at the collar, clung to his back with sweat, but he paid no mind. Jimmy had grown used to discomfort. Reaching his house, he pushed open the creaky gate and stepped inside. His mom sat at the kitchen table, her face lined with worry as she stared at the pile of bills before her. When she noticed Jimmy, she tried to smile, though it didn't quite reach her tired eyes. "Hey, Jimmy, how was your day?" she asked, her voice soft but tinged with weariness. "Same as always, Mom," Jimmy replied, placing a few crumpled bills on the table. "Sold some candy, made a little money." His mom's eyes lingered on the small pile of money before she let out a nearly inaudible sigh. "Every bit helps," she said, forcing a smile. Jimmy nodded, though he knew the reality of their situation all too well. The weight of the bills on the table felt heavier than the coins in his pocket. That evening, Jimmy sat outside on the stoop of their small home. The streetlights flickered on, casting long shadows across the uneven pavement. He watched as two police officers walked by, their eyes scanning the area. Jimmy tensed, his fingers drumming nervously against his knees. Memories of the night they took his father came rushing back, a mix of fear and helplessness that lingered like a shadow over his family. "Jimmy, come inside. It's getting late," his mom called from inside. Jimmy stood, brushing the dirt off his shorts, and went inside. His younger sister, barely 7, was already asleep on the old couch, her small frame curled up under a thin blanket. Jimmy watched her for a moment, a mix of protectiveness and frustration filling his chest. He wanted more for her, for their mom, but he didn't know how to make it happen. The weight of their reality pressed down on him as he lay on his mattress, tracing the cracks in the ceiling with his eyes until he drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, Jimmy was up before dawn, slipping out quietly to begin his day. Candy sales had been slow lately, but he greeted each passing parent and child with his best smile. As the day wore on, Jimmy ran errands for the neighbors, including buying groceries for Mrs. Alvarez and carrying heavy bags for Mr. Santos. By the time he started his walk home, the blazing sun had sapped his energy. Then, something caught his attention. Up ahead, a man in a wheelchair struggled to move. One of the wheels seemed stuck, and he was clearly in distress. Jimmy squinted, recognizing the man as Mr. George, who lived a few streets over. But before Jimmy could move to help, he saw something else: a large, aggressive dog barreling toward the man, teeth bared and growling. Jimmy froze, fear gripping him as the man's desperate cries for help echoed in the empty street. For a split second, he thought about running, but then he saw the terror on Mr. George's face. Without another thought, Jimmy dropped his bag and ran toward them, barefoot and fueled by adrenaline. Jimmy reached the wheelchair just as the dog lunged. Grabbing the wheelchair's handles, Jimmy yanked it backward, pulling Mr. George away from the snapping jaws. The dog's growl was guttural and vicious, and Jimmy could feel its hot breath as it lunged again, narrowly missing his arm. His muscles burned as he pulled the chair further, his heart pounding in his chest. A car horn blared in the distance, startling the dog just enough for it to hesitate. Taking advantage of the moment, Jimmy pulled Mr. George several more feet to safety. The dog eventually backed off, disappearing down an alley. Jimmy stood there, breathing hard, his hands trembling as he steadied the wheelchair. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Mr. George nodded, his face pale and his eyes wide. "Thank you," he stammered, his voice shaky. "You saved me, kid." Jimmy nodded, his muscles aching and his body drenched in sweat. He stayed with Mr. George until he was composed enough to wheel himself home. Then, Jimmy picked up his bag and began the long walk back, his legs still shaky. He didn't feel like a hero. He just felt tired. When Jimmy arrived home, his mom was waiting on the porch. "Jimmy, you're late. Everything okay?" she asked, concern in her voice. "Yeah," Jimmy said, hesitating. "I had to help someone." "Help someone?" His mom's brow furrowed. "What happened?" Jimmy explained, his words careful and his tone casual. But his mom's face turned pale as he spoke. "A dog? Jimmy, you could have been hurt." She grabbed his arm, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and pride. "Why didn't anyone else help?" "There wasn't anyone else," Jimmy said quietly. His mom pulled him into a tight hug. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "But please, be careful. I can't lose you too." Jimmy hugged her back, the weight of her words pressing against the lingering adrenaline in his veins. The next day started like any other. Jimmy returned to his usual spot near the school gates, selling candies with a smile despite the exhaustion that clung to him. As he walked home that afternoon, he spotted Mr. George sitting under the shade of a tree. "Hey, kid," George called out, a smile spreading across his face. "Didn't think I'd see you again so soon." Jimmy walked over, his hands in his pockets. "You doing okay?" he asked. George nodded. "Thanks to you. You've got a brave heart." "Jimmy." Jimmy looked away, feeling his face heat. "I just did what I had to do." George's smile softened. "What you did mattered, kid. Not everyone would have done the same." The following day brought an unexpected surprise. A sleek, luxurious car pulled up in front of Jimmy's house, drawing the attention of curious neighbors. The man who stepped out was well-dressed, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement as he approached the house. "Jimmy?" the man called. Jimmy stepped forward cautiously. "Yeah, that's me." The man extended a hand. "I'm Michael. My father, George, told me what you did for him. I wanted to thank you personally." Jimmy's mom appeared in the doorway, her expression wary. Michael smiled warmly. "Your son saved my dad's life, Mrs. Harris. We'd like to offer your family some help as a thank you." Jimmy and his mom exchanged a look, the weight of the offer hanging in the air. They knew it could change their lives, but trust wasn't something they could give lightly. After a moment, Jimmy's mom nodded slowly. "Let's talk," she said, her voice steady but cautious. And with that, the seed of hope was planted, promising a future that just might be brighter than they ever imagined.